Thank you for joining us on our look at life in the court of Cleopatra. Before we begin, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. Your support really does help us. Now lie back, dim the lights and enjoy our look at life in the court of Cleopatra. To step into Cleopatra's court was to enter a world of contradictions. The first breath you took in Alexandria was heavy with salt from the Mediterranean, but laced with frankincense from the palace's burning braziers. The first sight was dazzling: ivory towers, courtyards lined with palm trees, golden statues of gods whose names were spoken in Greek and Egyptian alike. Yet beneath the shimmer, there was always a tension, a current that hummed just below the surface, reminding you that this was not merely a city of splendor. It was a city braced against encroaching empire, a city that balanced on a knife's edge between survival and conquest. Alexandria was unlike anywhere else in the ancient world. Founded by Alexander the Great 3 centuries earlier, it was designed to be the meeting point of East and West, where the philosophies of Athens might sit alongside the rituals of Memphis, where merchants from as far as India and Spain bartered in markets alive with color and sound. Its streets were crowded with marble villas and crumbling mud brick homes, its alleys filled with languages from every corner of the Mediterranean. To serve Cleopatra here was to feel you were at the center of the world, and yet precariously at its edge. The palace itself was a marvel, a sprawling complex said to cover a quarter of the city's royal quarter. Great halls with ceilings so high they seemed to vanish into the shadows, mosaics so intricate they told stories of gods, heroes, and forgotten kings in 1,000 tiny tiles. Perfumed pools reflected torchlight, and gardens bloomed with imported flora, carried across deserts and seas to impress foreign envoys. And in the midst of it all was Cleopatra, last of the Ptolemies, Queen of Egypt, but also a woman constantly at war with perception, a ruler who had inherited not only a throne, but the burden of keeping her nation independent against Rome's ever-growing shadow. For those who served her, scribes, advisors, philosophers, attendants, guards, the palace was both paradise and prison. You might spend your days immersed in the greatest learning center of the ancient world, passing by scholars who recited Homer or calculated the movements of stars in the halls of the great library. Or you might spend them standing watch at a banquet where every word could carry the weight of treason, where a single misstep in protocol might cost you more than your position. To survive here required not only loyalty, but adaptability. It required the skill to navigate opulence without succumbing to it, to read the currents of politics as deftly as any sailor read the Nile. Each morning began with ritual. Cleopatra was no ordinary monarch. She was Isis incarnate, a living goddess. Courtiers rose at dawn to prepare her audience chamber. Floors swept until they gleamed, incense filling the air with thick sweetness, offerings laid out on altars to the gods who had long watched over Egypt. Attendants brought robes dyed in Tyrian purple, pearls strung from distant shores, oils pressed from lotus flowers. When the queen entered, every eye lowered, every voice hushed. Yet those who knew her saw past the theatre. Cleopatra was shrewd, educated in rhetoric and philosophy, fluent in the tongues of her allies and enemies alike. She did not simply rule, she performed, bending perception into power. If you were fortunate enough to stand among her court in these moments, you witnessed a kind of alchemy. Cleopatra could speak with priests in the language of ancient Egypt, then turn to debate with Greek scholars in their own tongue, before greeting Roman envoys in Latin. Few rulers commanded such breadth, and in her mastery of words lay her greatest weapon. Rome might possess armies, but Cleopatra possessed persuasion, seduction not in the carnal sense alone, but in the ability to bend people to her cause. For a courtier, this was as dangerous as it was dazzling. If you failed to match her wit, you were nothing. If you impressed her, you might rise, but with that rise came attention, envy, and peril. Banquets showcased this duality most clearly. Imagine the long halls of the palace, torchlight shimmering across silver goblets, tables laden with figs, honey cakes, roasted goose, fish drawn from the Nile. Music drifted from lyres and flutes. Dancers moved between columns painted with the stories of gods. To outsiders, it was a vision of endless pleasure. To those seated within, it was theatre. Where you sat revealed your standing. Whom you toasted revealed your allegiance. Each gesture was a message, each laugh a signal. To share a cup with the Queen was to ascend in the hierarchy, but it also painted a target on your back. In this world, privilege and danger were one and the same. And yet, the contradictions went further still. To serve in Cleopatra's court was to live at the peak of civilization and yet constantly feel the breath of ruin. Outside the palace walls, Rome loomed. Caesar had already come and gone, leaving behind both political entanglement and a child. Now Mark Antony's presence tied Egypt's fate to Rome's civil wars. As a courtier, you lived with the knowledge that your future did not rest solely on your queen's brilliance, but on the whims of men across the sea who saw Egypt not as sovereign, but as prize. Every whisper from the Senate, every rumor from the Roman Forum echoed through Alexandria's halls. In this sense, the palace was not a sanctuary at all. It was a battleground, albeit one fought with gold instead of swords. You might spend your morning drafting decrees for grain shipments, your afternoon watching a debate between philosophers in the library, and your evening listening to envoys argue over naval alliances. Yet in every act, survival hung in the balance. A delayed shipment might spark unrest in the city. A poorly chosen word might anger a Roman ally. A misread expression from Cleopatra herself could end a career. To live in her court was to be constantly aware of the invisible scales. Scales that weighed not only wealth and power, but loyalty and fate. Still, there was no denying the allure. For many courtiers, this was the height of existence. To walk the marble halls of Alexandria was to be at the center of knowledge, culture, and beauty unmatched in the world. You might hear a philosopher expound on the shape of the cosmos in the morning, attend a performance of Euripides by afternoon, and end your evening in conversation with traders who had seen lands beyond the Red Sea. You might taste spices brought from India, wear silks from China, read scrolls copied from lost cities of Mesopotamia. The palace was a world in miniature, a place where every corner of the known earth seemed to converge. And yet, even in splendor, fear lurked. Cleopatra was loved, but she was also feared. Her intelligence was matched only by her ruthlessness. She rewarded loyalty handsomely, but betrayal, or even suspicion of betrayal, was answered swiftly. Stories spread of courtiers who vanished after a whispered slight, of rivals who fell mysteriously ill after rising too quickly in favor. To thrive in this court meant not only serving the queen, but surviving her scrutiny. It meant knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, and when to bend without breaking. What strikes you, standing in those halls, is the fragility of it all. For all its marble and mosaics, the palace was not built on stone, but on shifting sands of politics, alliances, and the queen's precarious hold against Rome. Each banquet, each decree, each whispered conversation was an act of resistance, a way of keeping Egypt independent for one more season. And for you, as one of the queen's chosen few, the contradiction defined your every breath. You lived among splendor, but you served amid peril. You basked in beauty, but you walked in shadows. You were part of history's most dazzling court, and its most dangerous. To live in Cleopatra's court was not to sip endlessly from goblets of wine or recline on couches of silk. It was to stand in the eye of a storm, surrounded by splendor that could vanish in an instant. The marble, the music, the perfumes, they were real, yes. But so too was the ever-present threat of betrayal, invasion, or collapse. And as you moved through those corridors, as you bowed before your queen, as you weighed each word you spoke, you understood the truth. The palace was not only a monument to power, it was a theatre of survival. To live in Cleopatra's court was to exist within a rhythm both rigid and unpredictable, a daily cycle that reflected the order of ritual and the chaos of politics. At dawn, when the city outside was still rousing itself, the palace already stirred. Servants padded barefoot through vast courtyards, carrying pitchers of water, trays of figs and bread, jars of oil for anointing. Incense smouldered from copper bowls, its thick sweetness masking the odor of torch smoke and sweat. This was the beginning, the quiet before the tide of ceremony swept through the halls. If you were part of Cleopatra's household, you knew precisely where you belonged in this dance. The queen's attendants prepared her garments. Robes dyed in the deep purple extracted from Tyrian shellfish, shimmering linen woven with gold thread, jewels threaded from pearls and emeralds brought by caravan across the desert. Another group prepared cosmetics kohl to darken her eyes, malachite ground to powder for shadow, red ochre for lips. This was no mere vanity. It was ritual, an armor of beauty, each layer painted with meaning, linking the queen not just to royalty, but to the goddess Isis herself. As she was adorned, priests chanted prayers to ensure divine favor, and every servant moved with reverent precision. To fumble a robe, to drop a jewel, was to invite more than rebuke. It was to risk being seen as careless in the presence of a living goddess. Meanwhile, scribes assembled in the audience chamber. Rolls of papyrus, sealed in wax, carried petitions from every corner of Egypt, grievances of farmers in the Nile Delta, reports from military outposts on the desert's edge, warnings from merchants about Roman ships sighted off Cyprus. Courtiers whispered among themselves, weighing which messages might be heard first. Every choice mattered. To have your petition raised to Cleopatra's ears meant influence, perhaps advancement. To be overlooked meant obscurity, or worse, suspicion of irrelevance. By mid-morning, the chamber doors opened. Guards in bronze breastplates and helmets of Greek design flanked the throne. The courtiers, arrayed in bright robes, bowed low. Cleopatra entered, her presence transforming the atmosphere. Accounts describe her voice as low and melodic, her wit quick, her gaze unsettlingly direct. Here, in the hushed chamber, she became Isis on earth, the mediator between mortals and gods, and yet also the sharpest political mind in the room. To serve in this audience was to witness the merging of ceremony and governance, a performance where law and theatre were inseparable. She might receive a delegation from Jewish merchants of Alexandria, their concerns written in Greek and spoken in Hebrew. She might summon a Greek philosopher to debate matters of astronomy, listening intently while scribes recorded his words for the library. A Roman envoy might step forward, bringing news of civil strife in the Senate, and the mood would shift instantly, for Rome's shadow was ever present. Each meeting was a layer in the mosaic of her reign, each audience a stitch in the fragile fabric of Egypt's independence. For a courtier, the task was not only to listen, but to interpret. Every pause in her speech, every glance exchanged between envoys, carried meaning that might determine alliances or enmities. As the sun climbed higher, the palace grew busier. Messengers arrived breathless from the docks, reporting the cargoes of ships, grain from the fertile Nile Valley, destined for hungry Roman markets. Linen woven by Egyptian hands, ivory from Nubia, spices from the Red Sea. The palace was the hub through which this wealth passed, and Cleopatra knew it. She understood that Egypt's survival lay not only in armies or treaties, but in the steady flow of grain that made her indispensable to Rome. As a courtier, you watched her transform trade into power, negotiating contracts as though they were weapons, reminding Rome that its legions marched on Egyptian bread. By midday, the queen often withdrew to her private study or to the gardens overlooking the sea. These moments, while quieter, were no less calculated. Here she consulted with astrologers who traced the movements of planets across papyrus charts, priests who interpreted omens in the entrails of sacrificed birds, generals who outlined troop movements on sand tables. To walk in these gardens as a member of her court was to sense the collision of worlds, the fragrant roses imported from Syria, the statues of Greek heroes, the hieroglyphs carved into pillars that linked her to the pharaohs of old. Cleopatra curated her surroundings with the same care she curated her alliances. Meals, when they came, were as much ritual as nourishment. Courtiers gathered in airy halls where tables groaned beneath platters of figs, grapes, pomegranates, roasted meats, and bread still warm from the ovens. Wine from the delta flowed freely, though those with experience knew to sip sparingly. Loose tongues in Cleopatra's court had ended more than one career. Seating was never accidental. To find yourself beside a trusted advisor of the queen was a signal of favor. To be placed at the edge of the table was a warning. Banquets, even at midday, were stages where the drama of hierarchy was performed for all to see. Afternoons often carried an unpredictable rhythm. Cleopatra might commission a reading from the library, a rare text from Babylon, a scroll of Aristotle, or a fragment of lost poetry. Philosophers debated in her presence, their words rising and falling in the measured cadences of Greek rhetoric, while she listened with the sharpness of one who had been trained since girlhood in persuasion. Or she might summon musicians, the sounds of lutes and drums filling the chamber, while dancers performed stories of gods and heroes. To an outsider it might appear as leisure, but for the courtiers who observed, it was strategy. These spectacles were reminders of Egypt's cultural wealth, a message to envoys that Rome might wield armies, but Egypt wielded civilization. The pace of the court shifted as the sun sank lower. Late afternoons brought a second round of audiences, envoys, military officers, or sometimes simple citizens granted rare permission to plead their cases. This was Cleopatra at her most formidable, for she understood the power of performance, not only for allies but for her own people. To witness her in these moments was to see the deliberate weaving of myth and reality. She was queen and goddess, but also a ruler listening to the grievances of her subjects. In a city as volatile as Alexandria, this was not theatre alone. It was survival. Evenings in the palace blazed with firelight. Banquets at night surpassed those of midday in spectacle. Torches reflected off gilded walls, the air thick with incense, the tables even more lavishly adorned. Courtiers reclined on couches, musicians played, poets recited verses in honor of the queen. And yet, beneath the laughter and applause, tension simmered. Every word was weighed, every gesture scrutinized. A toast to Cleopatra might elevate you. A poorly timed jest might condemn you. The night was theatre, but it was also judgment, and no one present could forget it. For courtiers, life outside these halls was scarcely less demanding. Residences in Alexandria were filled with intrigue, every neighbor listening for whispers, every rival ready to exploit weakness. When you left the palace after a day of ceremony, you carried its weight with you. To be seen walking with a Roman envoy might spark rumors. To be absent from a banquet might suggest disloyalty. The court followed you into the city, into the markets, even into your home. There was no escape from its rhythm. What marked this daily cycle was its blend of splendor and strain. On the surface, life in Cleopatra's court appeared as paradise. Fine clothes, rich feasts, proximity to a queen whose name was already legend. Yet the deeper reality was constant vigilance. Every hour brought new risks. Every ritual carried hidden stakes. Every day was both a privilege and a trial, an opportunity to rise and a danger of falling. And always, above it all, there was Cleopatra herself. She moved through these rhythms with an ease that concealed the strain beneath. She was mother, monarch, strategist, goddess, and actress all at once, and her courtiers mirrored her performance, knowing that to falter was to disappear. The rhythm of the court was the rhythm of survival. It was the heartbeat of a queen who defied Rome as long as she could, and of the men and women who lived in her shadow, caught between devotion, ambition, and fear. To live as a member of Cleopatra's court was to understand that every feast was more than a meal. It was theatre, and the stage was nothing less than the fate of Egypt. The food, the music, the poetry, the dancing, all were deliberate acts of spectacle, performances that bound allies closer, unsettled enemies, and reminded everyone present that Egypt was not only a kingdom of fertile soil and ancient gods, but also of enduring magnificence. Banquets in Alexandria were never simply indulgence. They were weapons, wielded with precision by a queen who understood that perception often mattered as much as power. From the moment you entered the banquet hall, the message was clear. Columns carved with lotus blossoms rose towards ceilings painted with constellations, their stars glittering in the torchlight. Statues of gods, Isis, Osiris, Horus, stood alongside likenesses of Greek deities, a visible declaration of Egypt's fusion of cultures under Ptolemaic rule. At the far end of the hall, upon a raised dais, Cleopatra reclined on a couch draped in silk, her presence both commanding and magnetic. Around her, courtiers gathered in a carefully orchestrated arrangement. Where you sat, who sat beside you, even the direction you faced. All spoke volumes. Proximity to the queen was privilege, distance a subtle rebuke. As the first platters were unveiled, you could not help but marvel at the abundance. Geese roasted with herbs, fish fresh from the Nile, baskets of figs and dates, honey cakes glazed until they gleamed, grapes and pomegranates bursting with juice. There were delicacies imported from afar, pepper from India, cinnamon from Arabia, olives from Greece, wine from the Aegean. Each dish told a story of Egypt's wealth and its reach across the Mediterranean world. And yet, to Cleopatra, these were not just delicacies, they were signals. Each imported flavor reminded Rome that Egypt controlled trade routes stretching beyond its borders. Every guest who tasted pepper or cinnamon tasted evidence of Cleopatra's power to connect worlds. The feast itself unfolded in acts like a drama. The first act was abundance, food in quantities so vast it seemed inexhaustible, reminding every guest that Egypt's granaries and markets overflowed while other nations hungered. The second act was entertainment. Musicians strumming lyres, flutists weaving melodies, singers reciting verses of Homer or new poetry crafted to praise the queen. Dancers performed tales of gods and heroes, their bodies moving with grace, their shadows rippling against the walls. The third act was conversation, and this was the most dangerous of all. For a courtier, to dine at Cleopatra's table meant not only eating and drinking, but speaking with precision. Every remark was measured, every gesture interpreted. A toast to the queen might seem straightforward, but the timing of it mattered. To raise your cup too early suggested desperation, too late, and it hinted at reluctance. A comment on the excellence of the wine was also a comment on the success of Egypt's trade. To praise the dancers was to acknowledge the artistry of Alexandria, a city where cultures converged. To criticize, even lightly, was to risk seeming ungrateful, or worse, disloyal. You learned quickly that banquets were not occasions to relax. They were trials in diplomacy, and the audience was always Cleopatra herself. She, of course, understood this better than anyone. Cleopatra used these feasts as stages upon which she could project her identity. She would recline adorned in jewels, pearls glistening against her dark hair, robes flowing in colors that shifted with the light. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried weight. A question directed at a Roman envoy could unsettle him more than any threat. A jest shared with a loyal courtier could elevate their standing instantly. The feast was her theater, and every guest was both actor and spectator. But beneath the splendor lay tension. Wine flowed freely, loosening tongues, and as the night wore on, truths often slipped through laughter. A careless remark about Roman politics, a boast about Egypt's military, even a story told with the wrong inflection. These could ignite suspicion. Courtiers learned to read one another as carefully as they read scrolls. Was the man beside you truly jesting, or was he baiting you into revealing disloyalty? Was the envoy across the table smiling from amusement, or smirking in contempt? To dine here was to sit at the intersection of theatre and espionage. The symbolism extended beyond words. Music itself was political. When musicians played hymns to Isis, they affirmed Cleopatra's divine identity. When Greek poetry was recited, it reminded Roman guests that Egypt shared their cultural heritage, not merely their trade. When Egyptian dancers performed sacred movements, it asserted that this was a land rooted in traditions older than Rome itself. Every note, every rhythm, every performance was calculated. To sit in the hall was to be enveloped in propaganda, though it was so exquisite you scarcely noticed. As the evening deepened, spectacle often reached its height. Cleopatra, ever conscious of the myths that surrounded her, sometimes staged displays that blurred the line between reality and legend. One story, whispered long after, told of her dissolving a pearl in vinegar to demonstrate her wealth to Mark Antony, consuming in a single gesture more than most kingdoms could afford. Whether true or embroidered, such tales reveal the essence of her feasts. They were not simply about satisfying hunger, but about crafting narratives that would outlast her reign. Yet for courtiers, the feasts were not only about survival or symbolism. They were moments of contact with the queen, the fleeting chances to impress or to fall from favor. A glance, a word, a smile from Cleopatra could transform a career. To be invited to recline closer to her was to ascend in prominence. To be moved further away was to sense your decline. The feasts were as much about social positioning as they were about sustenance, and each evening reshuffled the unspoken hierarchy of the court. Still, the danger was constant. feasts could end in celebration or in silence. Rumors told of courtiers who spoke too boldly and were never seen again, of foreign envoys whose words angered the queen and who found themselves escorted out of Egypt by dawn. Privilege and peril were inseparable. To feast in Cleopatra's hall was to bask in splendour with the knowledge that splendour might also be your undoing. When the banquet finally drew to a close, when the musicians laid down their instruments and the last goblets were drained, courtiers filed out into the night air. The city outside hummed with life, its streets lit by torches, its taverns echoing with laughter. Yet the courtier who had dined with Cleopatra carried with them the weight of the evening. The alliances hinted at, the suspicions sparked, the silent calculations of power. The feast might be over, but its consequences lingered long after. And so the rhythm of the court continued. Each feast was followed by whispers in the corridors, by letters carried in secrecy, by alliances forged in candlelit chambers. The splendour of the banquet hall was only the visible part of the drama. Beneath it lay a web of intrigue spun tighter with every passing day. In the end, to understand life in Cleopatra's court was to understand that food, music, and theatre were not diversions but instruments of rule. The queen's banquets were not indulgences but strategies, stages upon which Egypt's independence was performed night after night. And for those who lived within that world, the courtiers, attendants, and envoys, every bite of bread, every sip of wine, every note of music was part of a game whose stakes were nothing less than survival. To live in Cleopatra's court was to be enveloped not only in splendour and intrigue, but also in knowledge. Alexandria, the queen's city, was the intellectual heart of the ancient world, a place where scrolls from every corner of the known earth were gathered, translated, debated, and preserved. For a courtier, the library and its sister institutions were more than repositories of learning, they were instruments of power. Knowledge in Cleopatra's hands was no less a weapon than armies or fleets. To be summoned into her presence with a scroll in hand was to be part of a theatre of intellect, one where philosophy, science, and literature were pressed into service of politics, identity, and survival. The great library was already legend in its own time. No one knew precisely how many scrolls it held. Some claimed hundreds of thousands, others more. But its ambition was clear: to collect the whole of human thought, to ensure that no fragment of wisdom was lost. Ships docking in Alexandria were searched for manuscripts, their works copied before being returned, so that the library grew ceaselessly. Here, you could find fragments of Homer side by side with Egyptian texts thousands of years old, medical treatises from Hippocrates alongside astronomical charts from Babylon. To walk among its shelves was to walk through centuries of human curiosity. Yet within Cleopatra's court, the library was not a museum of the past, but a living tool. The queen herself was steeped in learning, one of the few monarchs who could converse fluently in multiple languages and debate on equal footing with scholars. She did not use the library as ornament, but as arsenal. When she spoke to envoys, she quoted Greek philosophers. When she addressed priests, she invoked Egyptian hymns. When she negotiated with Romans, she demonstrated her grasp of their laws. Each reference, each fragment of knowledge, was chosen to strengthen her position. For her courtiers, this set a high standard. To serve her meant to be ready not only with loyalty, but with learning, to have the right passage, the right precedent, the right interpretation at hand. Life in these halls carried its own rhythm. Scholars sat in clusters, dictating to scribes who copied every word. Astronomers traced the movement of the stars, plotting patterns that would guide navigation and suggest omens. Physicians studied anatomy with scrolls spread across tables, arguing over remedies, debating the balance of humours. Poets recited verses, their voices echoing off marble walls, while philosophers sparred in arguments that could stretch for hours. To be a courtier in this space was to hover between worlds, half participant, half observer, always alert to the moment when Cleopatra might summon you to present knowledge as though it were treasure. Knowledge was, in truth, treasure. Egypt's survival depended on projecting not only wealth but wisdom. Rome had its legions, but Alexandria had its library. When foreign envoys entered these halls, they were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. by the sense that here lay the intellectual core of civilization. Cleopatra ensured that the court used this impression. A Roman envoy might be shown a rare manuscript of Aristotle, or led through a room filled with maps of the heavens. A Jewish delegation might be invited to witness Greek translations of Hebrew scripture. Each encounter demonstrated Egypt's role not as a backwater awaiting conquest, but as a civilization too rich, too sophisticated, too vital to be dismissed. But the court also knew that knowledge was not neutral. Ideas could be dangerous. A mistranslated word might spark dispute between priests. A philosopher's theory could be twisted into political argument. A prophecy written centuries earlier might be invoked to justify war or peace. Cleopatra herself understood this deeply. She commissioned translations, supported scholars, and employed priests and scribes not merely to preserve knowledge but to shape it. To be a member of her court in this context was to witness the transformation of wisdom into policy, myth into strategy. You might be called upon to assist in such tasks. Perhaps you escorted scholars into the Queen's presence, carrying scrolls of medical remedies to aid her physicians. Perhaps you listened as she discussed the stars with astrologers, her questions sharp, her grasp of celestial cycles unnervingly precise. Perhaps you delivered to her a papyrus, carrying the latest translation of Homer, knowing that she would use its verses to frame herself as heir not only to Egypt but to the legacies of Greece. In such moments, the grandeur of the library was not abstract but immediate, woven directly into the pulse of politics. For courtiers, these intellectual performances could be perilous. To present knowledge inaccurately, to misquote a passage, to fail to anticipate the Queen's intent was to risk humiliation, or worse. Cleopatra's memory was sharp, her expectations high. She could recall lines of philosophy with ease, shift from Greek to Egyptian without pause, demand precision in translation. Those who impressed her with scholarship might rise quickly in esteem. Those who faltered found their prospects dimming. The library, for all its splendour, was not a neutral sanctuary, but a crucible, one where courtiers were tested as surely as soldiers in battle. And yet, despite the risks, there was awe. To sit in those halls, to hold in your hands a scroll that carried the words of a thinker long dead, was to sense your place in something larger than yourself. For all the palace intrigue, for all the danger of misstep, there was also inspiration. You might hear a mathematician describing the geometry of the earth, a physician debating the circulation of blood, a philosopher pondering the nature of justice. These conversations, overheard in passing, carried echoes that outlasted the walls around you. They reminded you that, beneath the surface of politics, Alexandria was still the beacon it had always been. A place where ideas mattered, where human thought was gathered like grain, to be stored against the famines of forgetfulness. But even here, in this most rarefied of spaces, the contradictions persisted. For all its brilliance, the library was vulnerable. Fires had already scarred it, accidental or deliberate. Rome's wars loomed ever closer, and whispers haunted the corridors that the great collection might not endure forever. Courtiers who served Cleopatra knew this unease well. Every time a scroll was unrolled, every time a poet read aloud, there was the unspoken fear that these words might vanish, lost to conquest, to flames, to neglect. The knowledge that filled these halls was precious precisely because it was fragile. Cleopatra's use of the library was, in part, a defiance of this fragility. She wielded learning as a shield against Rome, as if to say armies may march, but wisdom endures. For her courtiers, to take part in this was to feel at once elevated and endangered, privileged to stand in the glow of such brilliance, but also aware that brilliance alone might not save them. You carried scrolls through corridors, knowing that legions crossed the sea. You listened to poetry even as news arrived of battles in Greece. You stood between the eternal and the immediate, the enduring dream of knowledge and the pressing reality of survival. When night fell over Alexandria and lamps were lit in the library, the rhythm shifted again. Scholars continued their work by flickering flame, courtiers whispered translations, and musicians sometimes played softly in the background, their melodies weaving into the murmurs of debate. The palace beyond prepared for feasts, but here in the shadowed halls another kind of banquet unfolded. One of words, ideas, and stories. To remain in these chambers after dark was to feel the weight of centuries pressing close, a reminder that while power might change hands, wisdom lingered, carried in fragile papyrus until someone read it anew. To live in Cleopatra's court was to experience this duality every day. You dined in splendor, walked through gardens of roses, bowed in rituals of gold, but you also sat in echoing rooms filled with scrolls and scholars, where the true wealth of Egypt was laid bare. The knowledge stored in Alexandria was as much a weapon as Cleopatra's fleets, and every courtier was drawn into the performance of intellect that defined her reign. And yet, for all its brilliance, the court knew that this treasure was as vulnerable as the queen herself. The great library stood as a symbol of civilization, but symbols could burn and dynasties could fall. For those who lived within its glow, the task was to savor the brilliance while it lasted, to play their part in the great theatre of knowledge, even as shadows of conquest lengthened over the sea. To live in Cleopatra's court was to experience this duality every day. You dined in splendor, walked through gardens of roses, bowed in rituals of gold, but you also sat in echoing rooms, filled with scrolls and scholars, where the true wealth of Egypt was laid bare. The knowledge stored in Alexandria was as much a weapon as Cleopatra's fleets, and every courtier was drawn into the performance of intellect that defined her reign. And yet, for all its brilliance, the court knew that this treasure was as vulnerable as the queen herself. The great library stood as a symbol of civilization, but symbols could burn, and dynasties could fall. For those who lived within its glow, the task was to savor the brilliance while it lasted, to play their part in the great theatre of knowledge, even as shadows of conquest lengthened over the sea. To sit in Cleopatra's court was to know that learning and power were inseparable. It was to feel the pulse of civilization gathered in papyrus scrolls, to hear wisdom transformed into policy, to watch a queen use philosophy as deftly as others wielded swords. It was above all to sense that you were living in a moment where the fate of knowledge itself hung in the balance. To live in Cleopatra's court was to inhabit a world built as much on suspicion as on splendour. The palace dazzled with feasts and philosophy, but behind the glittering farce, lay a constant current of intrigue. Politics in Alexandria was not a game but a battlefield, one where the weapons were words, alliances, and betrayal. To be a courtier here meant more than serving a queen. It meant surviving in a web spun so tightly that even the faintest vibration could pull you into peril. The Ptolemaic dynasty had always been riven with rivalry. Cleopatra herself had ascended through blood and strife, contending with siblings who sought her throne. That legacy of division lingered in the palace. Old loyalties did not vanish, they lingered like ghosts. Every corridor carried memories of conspiracies, and every banquet concealed plots. Courtiers knew that Egypt's throne was never entirely secure, that every smile could mask ambition, and that loyalty could wither in a single night. In this atmosphere, politics was theatre of the most dangerous kind. Outwardly, Cleopatra commanded her court with poise. She presided over ceremonies, hosted feasts, guided scholarship. But beneath it all, her rule was a tightrope. Rome's presence loomed ever larger. First through Julius Caesar, then through Mark Antony, and always through the Senate's restless hunger for Egypt's wealth. The court was divided between those who leaned toward alliance with Rome and those who whispered of independence, between Greeks who saw themselves as heirs of Alexander and Egyptians who clung to the ancient gods. These factions did not argue openly. Instead, they plotted in shadows, in letters passed by servants, in words murmured beneath music at banquets. Spies were everywhere. To speak carelessly, even in your own home, was to risk ruin. Servants, often overlooked, carried more than food and drink. They carried secrets. A misplaced word might reach Cleopatra's ears before dawn, twisted by rumor or sharpened by envy. Courtiers learned to master the art of guarded conversation, to cloak meaning in metaphor, to praise with such careful nuance that no one could call it criticism. Yet even silence was dangerous, for to say nothing in a world of whispers was itself suspicious. Cleopatra understood this world intimately. She had survived too many plots not to. Her gaze, sharp as any blade, could pierce through courtiers' masks. She rewarded loyalty lavishly, yet she punished betrayal with speed that left others trembling. Tales spread of advisors who fell from favor suddenly, vanishing from the palace without explanation. Their absence said more than any decree. For the courtiers who remained, each disappearance was a lesson. Power in this court was never permanent. It was borrowed, fragile, contingent on the queen's trust, and on the ability to avoid the snares of rivals. The games of intrigue reached beyond Alexandria's walls. Rome's civil wars rippled through the palace like storms across the sea. Courtiers aligned themselves with factions in Rome, wagering their futures on distant struggles. One day, an alliance with Caesar seemed certain. The next, whispers of Octavian's rise unsettled the court. Each envoy who arrived from across the sea brought more than news. They brought new possibilities, new dangers. To stand too firmly with one Roman was to risk destruction if another triumphed. To hedge loyalties was safer but more perilous still, for Cleopatra demanded conviction. In such times, messages carried more weight than armies. Couriers rode through the desert by night, their satchels filled with papyrus sealed in wax, each one carrying words that could change a dynasty. A simple letter, intercepted, altered, or delayed, could alter alliances, spark suspicion, or end lives. To handle such a message as a courtier was to feel its danger burn in your hands. A single misplaced scroll could unravel months of diplomacy. And so the palace became a hive of quiet manoeuvres, alliances formed not in open council, but in whispered promises. Rivalries sharpened in glances across banquet tables. Courtiers courted not only Cleopatra's favor, but that of her lovers, her generals, her priests, each of whom wielded influence in their own way. Mark Antony's presence added another layer, for he brought with him Roman followers whose ambitions often clashed with Egypt's traditions. To navigate between them was to walk through a minefield. A word of deference to Antony might secure Rome's goodwill, or it might be seen as betrayal of Cleopatra's sovereignty. For a courtier, the stakes were not abstract. Intrigue was lived in the body, in the tension of muscles at a banquet, in the dryness of the throat when asked a direct question, in the shiver that came when rumors spread of an execution. To survive was to cultivate habits of restraint, to learn when to laugh, when to nod, when to look away. It was to practice the art of remembering everything and revealing nothing. Yet even in such peril, ambition drove courtiers forward. To rise in Cleopatra's court meant wealth, estates, honor. It meant proximity to power greater than any in the ancient world. Men and women alike gambled their lives for a chance to step closer to the throne, knowing that failure meant exile or death. Some played the game brilliantly, weaving themselves into Cleopatra's trust. Others stumbled, undone by arrogance or miscalculation. The court remembered them all, for every fall was a cautionary tale. The heart of the intrigue lay not only in survival, but in shaping the queen's perception. To influence Cleopatra's view of Rome, to sway her interpretation of omens, to colour her judgment of an envoy. These were victories as significant as any won on a battlefield. Advisors who succeeded in guiding her thoughts became power in themselves, shadow rulers whose influence stretched across Egypt. Yet influence was a double-edged gift. The higher you rose, the more enemies gathered below, waiting for your misstep. At night, when the palace quieted, the sense of unease deepened. The torches flickered, the corridors emptied, but the whispers did not cease. Messages still changed hands, alliances still shifted. For the courtier lying awake in chambers overlooking the sea, the sound of waves was mingled with thoughts of plots unspoken, of daggers unseen. You dreamed of splendour, but woke in fear. And always, the question remained, whom could you trust? The answer, often, was no one. The truth of Cleopatra's court was that intrigue was not an accident but a condition of life. The palace thrived on it, as vines thrive on walls. Every feast, every audience, every walk through the gardens carried an undercurrent of hidden purpose. Cleopatra herself encouraged it in part. By keeping courtiers divided, she ensured their loyalty remained to her alone. In this way, Politics and intrigue were inseparable. The splendour of Alexandria dazzled the world, but it was held together by webs of suspicion, spun fresh each night and torn apart each morning. To be a member of this court was to learn the paradox of survival, that trust was fatal, that silence was perilous, and that words were weapons sharper than swords. You moved through halls of gold and marble, but beneath your feet lay quicksand. You smiled, bowed and toasted, but inside you calculated every syllable. The court was a game without end, one you could never step away from. Victory meant survival. Defeat meant disappearance. And so the palace at night remained alive with whispers. A candle guttered in a high chamber where an advisor penned a secret letter. A servant carried a folded papyrus tucked into a robe. Two courtiers leaned close in the shadows, their voices barely audible above the crackle of torches. The intrigues of Cleopatra's court never ceased, for they were the true lifeblood of power. And as you lay awake, listening to the silence between the waves, you knew that tomorrow would bring another round of the game. And that to falter, even once, was to lose everything. To imagine Cleopatra's court without women beyond the queen is to misunderstand it entirely. Though her presence dominated every space, the palace was filled with women whose influence, subtle or overt, shaped the currents of daily life and politics. They were mothers, sisters, priestesses, philosophers, wives, lovers, servants. And they were as much a part of the machinery of power as the generals and scribes who filled the halls. Life in Cleopatra's court was not only a tale of one extraordinary woman, but of the women who surrounded her, supported her, rivaled her, and carried her world upon their shoulders. The queen herself was the model upon which all else was measured. Cleopatra blurred the line between ruler and goddess, embodying Isis not only in ritual but in presence. Her court absorbed this example, and women who moved within it reflected her power in different ways. Priestesses dressed in white linen tended to her divine image, singing hymns and offering incense to sustain her role as living deity. Ladies in waiting attended to her with meticulous care, yet they also served as confidantes, privy to her moods and her strategies, carrying whispered instructions through corridors where men dared not tread. Their loyalty could elevate them into the queen's trust. Their betrayal cast them into obscurity. But beyond the inner circle, the role of women extended further. The Ptolemaic dynasty was built on a tradition of women wielding authority, often alongside their brothers or sons. Queens before Cleopatra had ruled as co-regents, had minted their images on coins, had walked beside pharaohs as equals in divine ritual. This legacy still pulsed in the palace. Women of noble families arrived at court as brides or hostages, their marriages binding alliances between factions. A daughter given to a priestly family could strengthen ties with Egypt's temples. A sister married into the Greek elite of Alexandria might secure loyalty from the city's most powerful clans. These unions were not acts of love, but instruments of strategy, and women bore the weight of these arrangements with grace or with bitterness, depending on their fortune. Yet not all influence was bound in marriage. Women moved in the court as patrons of learning, supporting poets, musicians, and scholars. They gathered in shaded gardens to hear readings, debated philosophy in Greek, offered interpretations of omens alongside priests. To be a woman of intellect in Cleopatra's Alexandria was no small thing. The queen herself encouraged such brilliance, for it reflected her own. Stories spread of women who dazzled not only with beauty, but with wit, who could turn a discussion of poetry into a subtle rebuke of Rome, or a debate on astronomy into a reminder of Egypt's divine destiny. In such spaces, power was expressed not through armies but through words. There was also the presence of women from beyond Egypt, whose lives entwined with the court through diplomacy. Daughters of foreign rulers arrived in Alexandria to cement alliances, their customs strange yet quickly absorbed into the melting pot of cultures. They brought with them new garments, new songs, new ways of speech, and their presence added to the court's cosmopolitan aura. To dine beside such women was to be reminded that Cleopatra's court was not isolated, but part of a wider Mediterranean world, where influence stretched across seas and deserts. The lives of women in the palace were not without peril. Rivalries flared often, sometimes as dangerous as those among men. To capture the queen's attention, even briefly, could spark jealousy. Whispers circulated about who had fallen from favor, about who had spoken too boldly or been caught in an indiscreet affair. Ambition did not discriminate by gender. Women in the court sought advancement for themselves and their families, and the game of intrigue included them as fully as it did their brothers and husbands. Alliances between women could be fierce and enduring, but betrayals cut deeper when they came from those closest to the queen. Servants and attendants, though often overlooked in the chronicles, played their own roles in this world. They were present in the most intimate spaces, in bedchambers, in bathing chambers, in moments of vulnerability. They dressed Cleopatra in her robes, painted her eyes, arranged her hair. Their hands touched the jewels of state and the tools of ritual. They heard conversations not meant for their ears, saw glances not meant to be witnessed. Their loyalty was assumed, yet it was always tested. To betray the queen's confidence was to court disaster, yet for some, the temptation of bribes from foreign envoys proved irresistible. Servants existed in the thin space between invisibility and indispensability, and their lives were both precarious and essential. Beyond the palace, women of Alexandria looked to Cleopatra's court as both inspiration and mirror. In the city's bustling streets, Jewish women, Greek women, and Egyptian women mingled, trading in markets, working in workshops, teaching children. They carried with them echoes of the queen's presence, for her image-adorned coins, statues, and temples. They prayed to Isis, wore jewelry that mirrored Cleopatra's style, told stories of her wit and power. The court's splendor reached into the lives of ordinary women, shaping aspirations and affirming the possibility of female strength in a world dominated by men. Religion gave women in the court another form of influence. Priestesses officiated in rituals that tied Cleopatra to divinity, their chants echoing in incense, filled halls. They prepared offerings, interpreted dreams, advised on omens. The fusion of religion and politics meant that their roles were never purely spiritual. To stand beside Cleopatra as she embodied Isis in a procession was to reinforce the legitimacy of her reign, to remind the people that their queen was not merely mortal. Priestesses could sway opinion, shape rituals, and ensure that Cleopatra's image as goddess remained unbroken. Even in diplomacy, women played their parts. Cleopatra's own relationships with Caesar and Antony were the most famous examples. But the court was filled with smaller, quieter connections. Wives and daughters of envoys became channels through which information flowed. Courtesans skilled in charm and discretion moved between chambers and feasts, carrying secrets between men who underestimated them. To dismiss the influence of such women was folly. They wove themselves into the very fabric of politics, not always visibly, but always significantly. Yet amid all this, there was always danger. For a woman at Cleopatra's court, the line between privilege and peril was thin. To be too ambitious invited suspicion. To be too beautiful drew envy. To speak unwisely could cost not only your place but your life. Stories spread of women who fell suddenly from the queen's grace, who vanished into silence, their names spoken only in whispers thereafter. Just as men were judged by loyalty and service, so too were women, and the queen's standards were uncompromising. Still, there was also resilience. Women who survived in the court developed skills as sharp as any blade, the ability to read unspoken cues, to navigate rivalries, to balance devotion with ambition. They created networks of support, subtle alliances that endured even in times of crisis. Some rose to positions of remarkable influence, guiding their families through the treacherous currents of politics. Others found power in smaller ways, in shaping cultural life, in preserving traditions, in ensuring that knowledge and ritual were passed on to the next generation. To live as a woman in Cleopatra's court was to live in a paradox. You moved within splendor beyond imagining, draped in fine linen, perfumed with oils, surrounded by music and learning. Yet every step carried risk, every glance could shift your fate. You lived in the shadow of Cleopatra's brilliance, a shadow that inspired, and intimidated in equal measure. To serve her was to glimpse the heights of female power, and to understand the cost of reaching so high. And always, above the court, the queen herself shone as the axis around which everything turned. She was mother, monarch, goddess, diplomat. She was inspiration and warning, proof of what women could achieve and reminder of how fragile even the greatest power could be. In her court, women were not silent ornaments, but active participants in the drama of history. They shaped alliances, influenced politics, nurtured culture, and bore the weight of expectations. Their voices might not always have been written in chronicles, but their presence resonated in every chamber of the palace. As night descended upon Alexandria, and the palace grew quiet save for the distant sound of waves, the women of the court retreated to their chambers. Some whispered prayers to Isis, some plotted futures for their children, some lay awake wondering whether their place in the queen's world would hold for another day. Their lives, like the queen's, were suspended between splendor and uncertainty, brilliance and fragility. To be a woman in Cleopatra's court was to live at the heart of power, knowing always that the heart could break. To live in Cleopatra's court was to inhabit a world where politics and religion were never separate. Every gesture of the queen, every public appearance, every ritual in the temple was carefully woven into a tapestry that presented her not merely as a monarch but as a goddess. For courtiers, priests, and servants alike, this fusion of divinity and authority defined daily life. To serve Cleopatra was not only to serve a ruler, but to participate in the living drama of Egypt's gods. The ancient tradition of pharaohs as divine figures was centuries old by the time Cleopatra reigned. From the pyramids of Giza to the great temples of Karnak, Egypt had always fused kingship with the sacred. But Cleopatra faced a unique challenge. She was not only queen of Egypt, she was also a descendant of Greek rulers who had inherited the throne after Alexander's conquest. Her subjects were a tapestry of Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and foreigners drawn to Alexandria's bustling harbours. To rule them all, Cleopatra required more than political skill. She needed to embody a symbol that transcended divisions, a figure who could unite her realm. She found that figure in Isis, the mother, the healer, the goddess of rebirth. Cleopatra as Isis was not a metaphor. It was a reality lived each day within the palace. Court ceremonies reinforced it constantly. When she entered the great halls, her attendants spread before her not merely rugs but ritual symbols. Priestesses sang invocations as though welcoming a deity. The queen did not simply speak with authority. She spoke with the weight of divine voice, her words treated as omens. For courtiers, this created both awe and unease. To serve her was to serve a goddess, a privilege beyond imagining, yet also a burden. Every error in ritual, every lapse in respect, risked sacrilege as well as treason. The palace itself echoed with this union of sacred and political. Chapels within its walls glowed with golden icons. Shrines to Isis stood beside statues of Greek gods, symbolizing the fusion of cultures that defined Alexandria. Courtiers often found themselves drawn into rituals, even if only as witnesses. They might be summoned at dawn to observe sacrifices made in the queen's name, to hear prayers spoken in Egyptian by priests who traced their lineages back to times before the Ptolemies. In those moments, you were reminded that you did not live in an ordinary court. You lived in a temple where politics itself was holy. Religion shaped not only ceremonies but daily life. Festivals filled the calendar, each blending tradition and innovation. During the Feast of Isis, processions spilled into Alexandria's streets. Courtiers marched beside priests, their garments shimmering in sunlight, their voices lifted in chants that mingled with the cries of the people. Cleopatra herself appeared not always upon a throne, but walking as goddess, the embodiment of fertility and power. To stand in her presence in those moments was to feel the boundaries of human and divine dissolve. Courtiers carried those impressions back into the palace, where even in mundane conversation they addressed the queen with reverence that bordered on worship. Yet religion in Cleopatra's court was never purely spiritual. It was political theatre of the highest order. When Cleopatra appeared as Isis, she was not only reassuring Egyptians of continuity with their ancient traditions, but also sending a message to Rome. To Roman envoys, Her image as goddess signaled independence and legitimacy. She was not merely another provincial monarch to be absorbed into the empire. She was a ruler with divine authority, her power sanctified by a culture far older than Rome's. Courtiers learned to recognize these performances as strategy, and their role was to amplify them. Every cheer, every bow, every carefully chosen word of praise reinforced the illusion that Cleopatra's divinity was unquestionable. Inside the palace, rituals reinforced this identity constantly. In private ceremonies, priests intoned sacred words as they anointed Cleopatra with oils. Courtiers might be called to witness such rites, their presence confirming legitimacy. The queen's body was transformed into a vessel of the divine, her gestures choreographed to mirror sacred iconography. To be chosen as witness was both honor and risk. You were being asked to confirm not only loyalty but belief, to act as participant in the great performance of godhood. Refusal or hesitation was unthinkable. The presence of Rome complicated these religious identities. When Caesar entered Alexandria, when Antony reclined in the palace halls, the rituals did not stop. Instead, Cleopatra adapted them. Before Caesar, she embodied Isis the mother, aligning herself with fertility and renewal, presenting herself as the mother of his child. Before Antony, she took on Isis the lover, the goddess of passion and devotion, crafting a union that mirrored divine myth. These transformations were not acts of deception, but of calculated fluidity. Cleopatra wielded religion as a prism, bending her image to reflect what was required. Courtiers observed these shifts with careful attention, for they determined how the court itself must behave, which hymns to sing, which rituals to emphasize. The burden of sustaining this divine image fell upon many shoulders. Priestesses rehearsed chants until their voices blended seamlessly. Artists worked tirelessly to craft jewelry, crowns, and robes that embodied sacred symbols. Attendants memorized every detail of ritual, from the arrangement of incense to the sequence of offerings. For them, mistakes were unthinkable. To falter in a ceremony was to risk shattering the illusion of godhood, to bring shame upon the queen and doom upon oneself. Courtiers knew these fears intimately, for they too were part of the performance. To kneel at the right moment, to raise eyes or lower them in perfect timing, was as essential as any hymn. The queen herself believed in the power of these rituals, not merely as strategy but as reality. Cleopatra was no cynic. She knew that to embody Isis was to shape destiny itself. In her mind, Rome's power was temporal, fleeting, but the gods were eternal. To anchor her rule in divinity was to place it beyond the reach of swords and legions. Courtiers, whether they shared this belief or not, were swept into it. They bowed in processions, they joined chants, they carried offerings. Some believed sincerely, others acted out of survival. But in the palace, sincerity and performance were indistinguishable. What mattered was that the illusion endured. Even outside the palace, the divine image reached into daily life. Coins bore Cleopatra's likeness alongside symbols of Isis. Statues in temples showed her with the crown of the goddess, her features carved with idealized beauty. Merchants sold amulets of Isis that blurred with amulets of the queen. For courtiers moving through Alexandria, these images were constant reminders your ruler was not simply a woman, but a goddess made flesh. To speak of her otherwise was to risk sacrilege, to mark oneself as enemy not only of the crown but of heaven itself. Yet for all its splendor, this divine identity was fragile. Rome, pragmatic and sceptical, regarded such claims with suspicion. To them, Cleopatra's divinity was arrogance, her rituals superstition. Courtiers felt this tension keenly when Roman envoys attended ceremonies. Their eyes lingered not with reverence but with calculation. They saw in Cleopatra's robes not godhood but theatre, in her crown not eternity but ambition. The courtiers who stood beside her in such moments carried the weight of that tension, knowing that belief and scepticism collided in every hymn. Still, within the palace walls, the faith was real enough to sustain power. To live in Cleopatra's court was to breathe incense thick with meaning, to walk corridors where shrines glowed with lamplight, to hear chants that blurred the line between politics and prayer. It was to see a queen step into the role of goddess and to participate in sustaining that illusion, whether by conviction or by necessity. For courtiers, the experience was overwhelming. You felt both exalted and burdened, privileged to serve a goddess yet fearful of misstep. You lived not merely in a palace but in a temple, where every act was ritual and every moment a prayer. And when the great processions ended, when the incense burned low and the crowds dispersed, the courtiers carried the memory back into their private chambers. The sound of chants echoed in their ears, the sight of Cleopatra crowned as Isis lingered in their eyes. They lay awake at night wondering whether they had witnessed divinity or performance, whether their queen truly stood among the gods, or whether she had woven a spell so strong that even doubt seemed heretical. In the end, it did not matter. Belief and power had fused. For as long as Cleopatra lived, so too did Isis, walking in flesh through the halls of Alexandria. For those who lived as courtiers in Cleopatra's court, Rome was not a distant power spoken of only in dispatches. It was a presence you could feel in the palace air, as heavy as the scent of incense, as constant as the Nile's tide. The Republic, and later the rising empire, sent its representatives not only as envoys but as shadows, reminders that Egypt's fate was bound to theirs. Rome was the largest power in the Mediterranean, and Egypt, with its wealth of grain, gold and trade, was both ally and prize. To serve Cleopatra in this age was to walk daily among Romans, to listen to their voices in council, to feel their eyes assessing every gesture. The arrival of Julius Caesar in Alexandria had been a turning point. For courtiers, his presence was both shocking and fascinating. Here was the most powerful man in the Roman world, lodged not as conqueror but as guest, entangled in Egypt's dynastic quarrels. To stand in the hall as Cleopatra and Caesar shared the throne was to sense that the world had shifted. Their union, personal and political, bound Egypt to Rome in ways no one could have foreseen. Courtiers watched as Cleopatra bore Caesarion, their child, a living symbol of alliance, and in that birth many saw both promise and peril. A Roman father, an Egyptian queen, the blending of two worlds that had been, until then, uneasy neighbours. Yet Rome's presence did not vanish with Caesar's death. It deepened with Mark Antony. His arrival at Cleopatra's side brought new intensity to the palace atmosphere. Antony was no distant statesman, but a man who embedded himself in Alexandria, dining, feasting, and living with Egyptian grandeur. Courtiers encountered him daily, his booming laughter filling banquet halls, his presence impossible to ignore. With Antony came legions of Romans, officers, soldiers, advisors, and suddenly the palace seemed divided between two cultures. Egyptians and Greeks moved with ritual and deference, while Romans strode with the blunt confidence of empire. The mingling was uneasy, at times cordial, at times fraught with suspicion. To be a courtier in these years was to live in the tension of this blending. The Romans brought with them customs unfamiliar to the Alexandrian elite. They spoke of discipline, of law, of the Republic's traditions, yet they also indulged in Egyptian excesses, marveling at feasts, reveling in processions. Some courtiers sought favour with Antony's officers, offering gifts and flattery to secure Roman goodwill. Others recoiled, wary of yielding influence to foreigners. Rivalries deepened as factions emerged, those who saw Egypt's survival only through alliance with Rome, and those who feared such ties meant eventual subjugation. Every whispered opinion carried risk, for no one could know how the winds of power would blow. Daily life itself bore the mark of Rome. In council chambers, debates now unfolded in three tongues: Greek, Egyptian, and Latin. Courtiers strained to follow, translators murmuring hurriedly, misunderstandings sparking tension. At feasts, Roman toasts mingled with Egyptian hymns. The clash of cultures visible even in the dishes served garum sauce from Italy beside honeyed figs from the Nile. Music alternated between Greek lyres and Roman horns. What had once been a purely Alexandrian stage had become an arena of cultural fusion, at times dazzling, at times jarring. For courtiers, proximity to Rome brought opportunity as well as peril. A single Roman patron could elevate your fortunes beyond measure. A word of approval from Antony might secure estates, titles, or favour. Some families prospered greatly, marrying their daughters into Roman households, cementing bonds that promised protection. Yet others saw their influence wane, their loyalty questioned if they were too close to foreigners. The balance was delicate. To be seen as too Roman was betrayal. To be seen as insufficiently Roman was foolishness. The court lived in a constant dance, adjusting to every new signal from Cleopatra herself. And Cleopatra was a master of this dance. She embodied Egypt for Romans, dazzling them with rituals and splendour. Yet she also spoke their language, quoted their laws, and matched them in intellect. Courtiers watched her enthrall Antony as she had once enthralled Caesar, not with submission but with brilliance. She did not cower before Rome, but embraced it, bending its leaders to her vision. For courtiers, this was both inspiring and terrifying. Their queen's power seemed unstoppable, yet they knew it was tethered to the unstable politics of Rome, where assassinations and civil wars reshaped the world with every passing season. In private, whispers circulated of how Romans truly viewed Egypt. To them, Alexandria was exotic, seductive, but also corrupt. Roman senators sneered at Cleopatra as temptress, at courtiers as sycophants drunk on luxury. Courtiers knew these opinions well, for they travelled in letters and rumours. Yet even as Romans mocked, they could not resist Egypt's wealth or Cleopatra's magnetism. It was a paradox. Rome desired Egypt and disdained it at once. To live in the palace was to embody that paradox daily, to be admired and dismissed, coveted and scorned in the same breath. The physical presence of Roman soldiers within the city was perhaps the most striking change. Their discipline contrasted sharply with Alexandria's fluid rhythms. Where Egyptians lounged in shaded courtyards, Romans drilled in formation. Where Greeks debated philosophy in gardens, Romans sharpened swords. Courtiers moved through streets where Roman standards fluttered, a reminder that the power sustaining Cleopatra's reign came not only from ritual and splendour but from steel. The sight unsettled many, for it whispered of occupation even as Antony spoke of alliance. The greatest tension lay in loyalty. Courtiers were forced to ask themselves, were they servants of Egypt alone, or of Egypt bound to Rome? To pledge loyalty to Cleopatra meant embracing her vision of union with Antony. But what if Antony fell? What if Octavian triumphed in Rome's civil wars? To tie yourself too closely to one Roman was to risk ruin at the hands of another. These questions haunted the court, keeping courtiers awake in their chambers, their minds racing with calculations of risk and reward. Yet, despite these anxieties, the palace glittered more brightly than ever. With Antony, Cleopatra staged spectacles designed to rival Rome itself. Banquets overflowed with food, music, and gold. Festivals presented Egypt as eternal, Antony as Osiris, Cleopatra as Isis, their union sanctified by gods. Courtiers participated in these pageants, their roles carefully choreographed, their loyalty displayed in ritual gestures. For a moment, the court could believe it had outshone Rome, that Egypt was not subordinate but superior. These were heady days, filled with splendour, that dazzled even as shadows lengthened across the horizon. Still, beneath the splendour, unease lingered. Courtiers knew that Rome was not merely in the palace. Rome was the palace's future. Every conversation with a Roman officer, every alliance forged, every rumour overheard was a thread binding Egypt ever more tightly to the Republic's destiny. The halls echoed with Latin not by chance but by inevitability. Courtiers sensed that their world was changing, that Alexandria's brilliance could not stand apart forever from Rome's hunger. And so life in Cleopatra's court during these years was lived in a state of constant doubleness. By day, you basked in splendour, served a queen who embodied divinity, witnessed banquets that surpassed imagination. By night, you whispered of Rome's armies, of Octavian's rise, of the uncertainty that lay across the sea. You stood in halls where Rome's presence was inescapable, in voices, in symbols, in soldiers, and you wondered whether you served a queen in her ascendance or one already tethered to the fate of empire. The courtiers who thrived were those who learned to navigate this doubleness. They spoke Greek to one ear, Latin to another, Egyptian to a third. They praised Antony in one hall and Cleopatra in another. They placed bets on futures that shifted with every rumour from Rome. Some survived this balancing act with brilliance, others fell, caught between loyalties too divided to reconcile. The court remembered their names in whispers, as warnings to those who dared too much or hesitated too long. Rome in the halls was more than presence. It was prophecy. It foreshadowed the world that would come after Cleopatra. when Egypt would no longer stand as sovereign kingdom, but as province of empire. Courtiers felt this even if they did not speak it. The laughter of Antony, the stride of Roman officers, the weight of Latin syllables, all were omens of a future none dared to name aloud. To live in Cleopatra's court in those days was to live in splendour already tinged with farewell. To live in Cleopatra's court was to exist in a paradox, a world of immeasurable privilege shadowed by constant peril. Few on earth enjoyed the splendour courtiers knew. To walk the palace corridors was to tread upon mosaics of polished stone, to feast beneath ceilings painted with stars, to wear linen woven fine enough to rival silk. Servants moved at your command. Scholars recited poetry for your amusement. Musicians filled the air with melody, while incense curled upward from braziers of gold. You dined on delicacies brought from every corner of the Mediterranean. Nile fish seasoned with rare spices, wine from the Greek Isles, dates sweet enough to cling to the tongue. At festivals, you watched your queen appear as Isis incarnate, radiant and unapproachable, and you marveled that you were among the chosen few who dwelt so near to divinity. And yet, for every taste of honeyed fig, there was the bitterness of fear. For every robe that draped your shoulders, there was the weight of suspicion. Privilege in Cleopatra's court was never secure, for to rise in favour was to draw envy like moths to flame. Courtiers whispered of rivals who vanished suddenly, their places at banquets left conspicuously empty. Sometimes they were said to have fallen ill, sometimes exiled to distant estates, sometimes found lifeless in chambers sealed before dawn. No explanations were given, none were needed. The message was clear. In this palace, fortune turned as swiftly as the Nile's floodwaters, and yesterday's favoured guest could be tomorrow's forgotten name. Cleopatra herself was both patron and judge of this balance. To serve her well was to be rewarded beyond imagining. Estates, titles, gifts of gold, even ships for trade could fall upon a family if the queen's favour shone. A single smile in public, a nod of approval at council, could elevate a household to prominence. Families who had languished in obscurity for generations found themselves suddenly entwined with power, their daughters betrothed to noblemen, their sons given positions in administration or command. To bask in Cleopatra's attention was to stand in sunlight so dazzling it blinded all else. But just as swiftly her gaze could cool. To displease her, to betray her trust, or to fail in duty meant more than personal disgrace. It could drag entire households into ruin. For courtiers, this reality meant living with constant calculation. Words were chosen with care, glances weighed as heavily as speeches. A careless remark could be reported by a servant or twisted by a rival. Even in laughter, courtiers measured themselves, never mocking in ways that might be misinterpreted, never praising too loudly lest it sound like flattery. At banquets, every gesture mattered. To raise your cup at the wrong moment, to appear inattentive during a hymn, could brand you as disrespectful. Rituals were not merely ceremony but tests, and to falter was to risk suspicion. The punishments for failure were not always spectacular, yet they were always effective. Exile was common. A sudden command to depart for an estate far from Alexandria, cut off from the court's pulse, left to wither in obscurity. Others met sharper ends. Stories circulated of men found drowned in the Nile, of women who vanished after being escorted from the palace under guard. None dared ask questions aloud. To inquire after a fallen courtier was to implicate oneself in their disgrace. Silence was the rule, broken only in whispers behind closed doors, where even then ears strained for the footsteps of listening servants. And yet, despite the peril, courtiers hungered for advancement. Ambition was as intoxicating as wine. To be close to Cleopatra meant not only wealth, but a glimpse of immortality, for she herself embodied divinity. Those who attended her processions stood at the heart of ritual that would be remembered for centuries. Those who advised her on matters of diplomacy shaped the course of nations. Even those who merely served in her presence carried the sheen of glory, their names tied to hers in memory. The lure of such privilege outweighed the risks, and so courtiers played the game, knowing it could cost them everything. The contrast between splendour and danger was perhaps most visible at banquets. These feasts dazzled beyond compare. Golden cups filled with spiced wine, tables laden with delicacies, music swelling from lyres and drums. Courtiers reclined upon couches, their garments shimmering with embroidered patterns, their fingers heavy with rings. Cleopatra and Antony presided like gods enthroned, their laughter echoing across the hall. Yet beneath the surface, unease coiled. Every guest watched every other, gauging favor, calculating alliances. A word spoken too warmly to a rival might shift suspicion. A glance exchanged at the wrong moment might ignite whispers of conspiracy. Feasts were theatre, but they were also arenas of subtle warfare. The servants who moved among the couches carried more than food and drink. They carried information. Courtiers knew that every sigh, every muttered aside, could be repeated. Servants were eyes and ears of the palace. Sometimes loyal, sometimes bribed, always present. To live in this court was to be watched constantly, to know that privacy was an illusion. Even in your own chamber, you guarded your tongue, for walls had ears, and silence was safer than careless words. The danger extended beyond politics. The sheer weight of luxury could be perilous in itself. Alexandria, with its wealth of trade, encouraged excess, and many courtiers fell prey to indulgence. Wine dulled caution, gold bred arrogance, and soon whispers followed of corruption, of men grown soft in splendor. Rome seized upon such rumors eagerly, mocking Cleopatra's court as decadent, unworthy of serious respect. Courtiers thus bore the double burden of living in luxury while proving they were not corrupted by it. To indulge too much was dangerous, to abstain too visibly was suspicious. The balance was impossible, yet essential. There was also the constant fear of betrayal. Alliances formed quickly and dissolved faster still. A friend one week might be a rival the next, their loyalty purchased by a gift or promise from another. Families turned upon one another, siblings against siblings, children against parents, all in pursuit of survival. To trust fully was a luxury few could afford. Some cultivated masks so carefully that even in solitude they remained guarded, unable to shed the performance. To live in Cleopatra's court was to forget the distinction between friend and rival, between laughter and threat, and yet, for all its dangers, the court inspired awe. To walk its halls was to feel the pulse of history. The great library of Alexandria stood nearby, a treasury of human knowledge. Philosophers debated beneath shaded colonnades. Mathematicians demonstrated wonders of geometry and astronomy. Poets recited verses that would echo through centuries. Courtiers could step from a chamber of political intrigue into a garden where scholars unravelled the mysteries of the stars. It was a world where danger coexisted with brilliance, where fear mingled with inspiration. Privilege was not only material but intellectual, a chance to dwell at the center of civilization itself. Still, none could forget that the splendor rested upon fragile foundations. Rome's shadow loomed larger with each passing year. Courtiers knew that their wealth and safety depended not only on Cleopatra's favor, but on the shifting tides of Roman politics. A triumph by Antony meant security. A victory by Octavian meant potential ruin. Whispers of battle across the sea carried into banquet halls, unsettling the laughter. Courtiers realized that their privilege could vanish not only by palace intrigue, but by the stroke of fate in a distant war. The paradox of privilege and peril defined every heartbeat of court life. To recline in luxury was to feel the edge of danger pressing against your throat. To rise in favor was to see the abyss of envy at your feet. To hold power was to risk losing it at any moment. Yet to step away, to refuse the game, was unthinkable. For those who had tasted the splendor of Cleopatra's court, life elsewhere seemed pale unworthy. Better to risk ruin in brilliance than to fade in obscurity. And so courtiers embraced the paradox, walking daily between splendor and fear. They feasted as though tomorrow would never come, even as they lay awake at night dreading what dawn might bring. They bowed before their queen with devotion, knowing she might raise them to glory or strike them down in an instant. They lived lives of unmatched privilege, and they lived under the shadow of peril so constant it became a companion. In this way, the court sustained itself, dazzling, dangerous, unforgettable. For those who had lived their lives in Cleopatra's court, the final years were filled with a tension unlike any that had come before. The glory of banquets, the splendor of festivals, the intoxicating blend of power and privilege. All of it began to unravel under the weight of war. Actium had changed everything. What had once seemed like a theatre of invincible grandeur collapsed into defeat. The courtiers who had witnessed Cleopatra enthrall Caesar, who had seen her and Antony parade as Isis and Osiris, now found themselves dwelling in a palace haunted by loss. The aftermath of Actium was a time of reckoning. Antony's fleets, broken and scattered, limped back to Alexandria. Many courtiers who had joined him in the campaign returned with hollow gazes, their bravado stripped away. Some did not return at all, their names whispered with pity or scorn. Those who had once boasted of Antony's invincibility now avoided the subject, their confidence shattered. Within the palace, the air grew thick with unspoken questions. Could Cleopatra still hold Egypt together? Could Antony recover his strength? And above all, how long before Octavian came? Cleopatra did not retreat into despair. To her courtiers, she remained a figure of brilliance even in decline. She moved through the palace with dignity, draped still in robes of splendor, her crown shining, her voice steady. Yet behind her eyes lay a steel that courtiers recognized with awe and fear. She summoned her treasury, counted her ships, measured her allies. Diplomacy became desperate, and courtiers were dispatched to far-off kings and generals with pleas for aid. Few returned with good news. The world was turning towards Rome, and Octavian's star was rising. For courtiers, survival became the unspoken goal. Some doubled down in loyalty, pledging themselves ever more fervently to Cleopatra and Antony, hoping to ride their fate wherever it led. Others, quietly and with great caution, began to hedge their bets. They whispered of sending messages to Octavian, of securing protection for their families should the palace fall. To be caught in such double dealings meant certain death, yet the temptation was great. Every day that passed without decisive action deepened the sense that time was running out. The palace itself reflected this decline. Once filled with the laughter of feasts, it now hosted councils marked by tension. Banquets continued, but their splendor rang hollow. Where once courtiers reclined with abandon, now they ate sparingly, their eyes darting to gauge the mood of their queen. Music still played, but the notes seemed fragile, thin against the silence that followed. Servants moved with greater caution, as though the walls themselves had become dangerous. Even the gardens, once vibrant with chatter and debate, fell quiet, courtiers reluctant to gather openly for fear of drawing suspicion. For those closest to Antony, the fall was most painful. Once a man of thunderous confidence, he now appeared diminished. He spent hours in brooding silence, drinking heavily, retreating into chambers where only his most trusted companions dared follow. To see Antony falter was to witness the collapse of one of the court's pillars, for his presence had once been as bright and overwhelming as the sun. Courtiers who had built their fortunes on his favor now found themselves adrift, scrambling to attach themselves more firmly to Cleopatra, whose resilience offered the only hope that remained. Yet even Cleopatra's brilliance could not disguise the tightening noose. Octavian advanced relentlessly, his legions moving with discipline and purpose. Reports arrived daily, carried by breathless messengers, each one more dire than the last. Cities that once pledged loyalty wavered or defected. Allies fell silent. The Nile's riches, once enough to sustain Egypt's independence, seemed suddenly fragile against the might of Rome. Courtiers gathered in anxious clusters, debating the news, yet always lowering their voices when footsteps approached. Fear hung over the palace like a storm cloud, unbroken, inevitable. Still, Cleopatra remained a strategist to the end. She explored every avenue to secure her dynasty's survival. Courtiers watched as she sent emissaries to Octavian, offering wealth, offering neutrality, even offering her throne if Caesarion might be spared. Some whispered that she considered sacrificing Antony to save Egypt. Whether true or not, the rumor spread like fire, sowing suspicion and fear among Antony's most loyal men. The court fractured further, trust dissolving into paranoia. To serve in these days was to live with constant dread, wondering whether you were about to be cast aside, whether your loyalty was about to cost you your life. And yet, amid the terror, the splendor never fully vanished. Cleopatra insisted upon maintaining ritual, upon presenting herself as Isis incarnate, even as Rome's armies closed in. Processions continued, though the crowds were smaller, their cheers less certain. The Queen's image still appeared on coins, her likeness carved in temples. For courtiers, these displays were bittersweet. They reminded them of Egypt's glory, but they also underscored the widening gulf between appearance and reality. The rituals that once seemed eternal now felt like defiance, beautiful but doomed. The final days were a descent into inevitability. As Octavian approached Alexandria, the palace braced itself for siege. The courtiers who had once enjoyed boundless privilege now found themselves confined, their freedom narrowed by fear. Some fled the city entirely, abandoning estates and titles to seek safety in distant lands. Others stayed, too bound to Cleopatra by loyalty or too afraid to risk escape. The palace filled with rumors that Antony planned one last desperate stand, that Cleopatra had hidden treasures in secret vaults, that Caesarion was being prepared to flee. Each rumor stirred fresh waves of hope and despair, but none changed the grim truth: Rome was coming. When Antony's forces finally collapsed, the end arrived swiftly. Courtiers witnessed scenes they would never forget. Antony, bloodied and broken, carried into the palace. Cleopatra, her face ashen but composed, retreating into her chambers. The grandeur of the court dissolved in those moments. The marble halls echoed not with music but with cries of grief. The women of the palace wept openly. Servants stood frozen, uncertain whether to move or remain still. For those who had lived through years of splendor, the sight of their rulers brought low was almost unbearable. Cleopatra's death followed soon after, and with it the court's final breath. The queen who had embodied divinity, who had enthralled Caesar and Antony, who had ruled as Isis incarnate, was gone. The courtiers who had built their lives around her brilliance were left adrift in silence. Some were taken by Octavian, their fates decided in Rome's cold halls. Others faded into obscurity, their names erased from memory. A few clung to remnants of privilege, serving Rome as administrators, but they knew they were only shadows of what had been. For those who survived, the memory of Cleopatra's court lingered like a dream. They remembered the golden banquets, the dazzling processions, the intoxicating blend of culture, power, and ritual. They remembered the thrill of serving a queen who seemed more goddess than mortal, the awe of witnessing history unfold. Yet they also remembered the fear, the betrayals, the sudden falls, the inexorable shadow of Rome. Their lives had been lived in brilliance and peril, and in the end they had watched it all dissolve into dust. The fall of the court was more than the end of Cleopatra's reign. It was the end of an era. Alexandria would continue to shine as a city of learning and trade, but it would never again be the seat of an independent Egypt. Rome absorbed its splendor, its wealth, its culture, leaving behind echoes of what once was. For the courtiers, those echoes were haunting. They had stood in halls that glittered with gold. They had heard music that seemed to touch the heavens. They had lived in the presence of a queen who defied empires. And now, all of it was gone. The story of Cleopatra's court did not end with her death alone, but the dispersal of those who had served her. Some carried tales of her brilliance into distant lands. Others remained silent, unwilling to relive the fall. But all bore the weight of memory, the bittersweet knowledge that they had lived at the heart of one of history's greatest courts, only to see it collapse before their eyes. For them, the splendor and the ruin were inseparable. To remember Cleopatra was to remember both the dazzling privilege of her court and the terrible peril that consumed it in the end.